Some marvellously weird animals have lived on our planet throughout the history of life. The fossil record provides a window into the deep past, and all the wonderfully strange creatures that inhabited it. One such example of a truly bizarre lineage of animals are the Conodonts, a mysterious group of organisms with an extensive fossil record. Yet, we didn't even know what they looked like, or indeed what sorts of animals they were, until the 1980s. The Conodonts are found in the fossil records of rocks all over the world, and they existed for an astonishingly long time, more than 300 million years. It's no surprise they left such a legacy. The Conodont fossils themselves are microscopic, but upon close examination it becomes clear that they look quite vicious. Conodonts first became known to science in 1856, when a Russian paleontologist documented their existence in the ancient Paleozoic rocks of the Baltic region. The Paleozoic is the era that came before the Mesozoic, which is when the dinosaurs appeared and rose to dominance. So these Conodonts were truly ancient, originating long before the first dinosaur evolved. This Russian paleontologist described tiny, lustrous, elongated remains, which he noted bore some similarities to fish teeth. These remains, which he called Conodonten, but which have since been anglicised as Conodonts, come in a variety of shapes. In addition to elongate, tapering forms, there are also ones in which long prongs are attached to comb-like structures of smaller points, and the elements can be variously curved or straight. Really, the diversity of different Conodont shapes is endless, and they're rather beautiful structures. Due to the diverse and easily distinguishable shapes of the Conodont fossils, and thanks to how commonly they turned up in different rock sequences, it became apparent that these mineralized elements could be used as index fossils. An index fossil is a fossil used to date specific rock layers. They must be easily recognizable, sufficiently distinct to identify the species they belong to, and exist individually for relatively short spans of geological time, and the different varieties of Conodont elements proved ideal for this purpose. This allowed paleontologists to identify the types of Conodonts fossilized in a particular sequence and get a pretty good idea of the age based on the species present. Therefore, for many rocks from the Paleozoic era, Conodonts are valuable tools for determining their position within the stratigraphic rock layers. However, although these fossils proved to have a very practical use for paleontologists and geologists, there was still the mystery of what they actually were, and what kind of animal had produced them. All scientists had were these complex and rather beautiful little mineralized elements, the only parts of the animal's bodies to fossilize, after the rest decayed away. But what did the whole animal look like? And what sorts of animals were they? The fossil record of our ancient planet was full of the remains of these creatures, and yet we had no idea what they were. Of course, paleontologists had plenty of hypotheses about what Conodont elements may have been, right from the start. The Russian paleontologist who first described them, Christian Heinrich Panda, suspected that they were the teeth of prehistoric fish. However, he was mystified as to how these teeth were arranged in their bodies, unsure if the teeth were placed in the jaws, or perhaps the lips, or even the tongue. Additionally, he was uncertain if the different varieties of Conodont elements all came from separate species, or if multiple different kinds might have been present in one animal. Panda speculated that whatever the Conodont animal was, it probably had no other hard mineralized parts apart from the teeth. As such, he hypothesized that they might somehow be related to hagfish and lampreys, living jawless fishes that lack mineralized hard parts. Later work on Conodonts involved other researchers pondering what these creatures could have been, such as a paper published in 1879 in which a British paleontologist concurred with Panda that hagfish and lampreys were probably the closest relatives to these animals. In 1926, another seminal work on Conodonts was published, in which the paleontologists once more agreed that these modern jawless fishes were a good bet for the closest relatives of some Conodont species, but also proposed that sharks and other kinds of fish might be the culprits behind certain other Conodont elements. This 1926 publication was also when Conodonts' use as index fossils in biostratigraphy was demonstrated, sparking much more interest in this curious type of fossil. The 1930s saw a flurry of papers being published on Conodonts, showing how they related to different layers of sedimentary rocks in the US and elsewhere. Then, in 1934, a couple of researchers came across what they termed Conodont assemblages. Rather than just finding the isolated individual elements, they had discovered entire associated apparatuses of multiple different elements. proving that many of the different types were indeed contained within the body of a single conodont animal. This resulted in a much improved understanding of how many different species of these creatures there actually are in the fossil record. Instead of naming each individual tooth type as a separate species, this now showed that one species can include several varying elements, and so a cleanup of conodont classification and naming conventions followed. One of these 1934 papers also mentions a very interesting alternative hypothesis to explain the conodont animal. The author of the study compared the assemblages of elements they'd found to the tooth structure of various other kinds of vertebrate animals, those animals with a backbone, concluding that they were dissimilar in every respect. Instead, they stated that the assemblages were almost identical to the jaw apparatus of annelid worms. Annelids, the segmented worms, are an extremely diverse lineage of invertebrates. This group includes the common earthworms, leeches, and polychaetes, or bristleworms, ubiquitous and mainly marine worms that come in all sorts of fantastic varieties. Lots of other groups are also included. This 1934 paper argued that the paired nature of the conodont elements was similar to the paired jaws of living annelids, and that the rarity of wear on the elements was similar to what's seen in annelids. In addition, no other hard parts are present in an annelid to become easily fossilized, just like with conodonts. So this paleontologist became convinced that conodonts were a kind of Paleozoic marine worm, not related to fish at all. Other researchers working on the conodont mystery in the 1930s also proposed that these elements might be from mollusks instead, perhaps being a part of the radula. These structures are embedded with lots of little teeth in modern mollusks, which are used to scrape at food. So it was argued, the resemblance to certain conodont elements suggested that the conodont animal was in fact a kind of Paleozoic sea snail. Still, others, also in the 1930s, argued that conodont elements were not the teeth of any extinct organisms. Rather, they considered these mineralized structures to be from the gills of prehistoric fish. Specifically, they thought the elements might be gill rakers, tiny projections that stick out from the gill arches of fish and trap food particles, functioning like a filter system. With all these alternative hypotheses floating around, the 1940s brought along even more bold ideas about conodont biology. In 1944, an American paleontologist proposed the idea that conodont elements had nothing to do with capturing food in any form. Instead, arguing that because many conodont elements had clearly been broken in life and then repaired during the organism's lifespan, he thought that they must be internal structures. He was fairly vague about what precisely this meant, simply stating that the elements functioned as the internal supports for tissues located at a place exposed to stress upon the exterior of or within the bodies of some genetically related group of marine animals. This particular claim prompted another researcher to publish a short note in 1944 proposing their own bold idea about the conodonts. If the elements weren't related to the mouth of an organism, but many of them still look like they're well suited to grasping and holding things, then where else in the body might they have been positioned? Obviously, they must be the copulatory structures, this person suggested, used by some lineage of worm to grip onto their partners while they mated. So paleontologists had in fact been dating rock layers using the sex hooks of prehistoric worms. You've got to appreciate the enthusiasm with which some of these guys were throwing out their ideas about conodonts. In 1954, another significant study on the affinities of the conodonts was published, largely dismissing some of these more fringe ideas. This research concluded that an internal skeletal function for the elements doesn't seem likely based on the general form of the structures, which appear to be for grasping. Additionally, the idea that they're the copulatory structures of worms was ruled out based on their chemical composition, plus the size and arrangement of the apparatuses themselves. Ultimately, this research came to the conclusion that either conodonts were some form of extinct vertebrate lineage, or they were worm-like invertebrates, but they simply couldn't say for sure which option it was. However, paleontologists weren't yet done with proposing different kinds of ideas for how the elements functioned within the animals. Another hypothesis created by a Swedish paleontologist in the 60s and 70s favoured the concept of these structures being the supports for lophophores, the feeding organs of certain marine invertebrates. Lophophores are essentially made up of tentacles arranged in a ring or horseshoe shape, enabling the animals that possess them to feed on particles of food suspended in the water column. This paleontologist's idea was that the conodont apparatus formed the basis of a lophophore, supporting an array of feeding tentacles while also functioning as a predator defense. Anything that came along trying to feed on the soft tentacles would end up biting into the hard, spiny parts of the conodonts. Illustrations of this hypothetical lophophore-bearing conodont animal were created, showing the creature as an oblong to elongate organism essentially built into the apparatus, with the spines of the mineralized elements projecting outwards to protect the soft interior. In the 1970s, a couple more ideas about the function of the conodont elements were proposed. One of these hypotheses presented an argument that the elements originated as primarily external structures, but over the course of the conodont lineage's evolution, there was an overall trend towards the elements becoming subsumed into pockets of the epithelium, the outermost tissue layer. Later conodonts, it was argued, had elements that were completely engulfed within the epithelium, but that could be extended outwards, emerging from these pockets to function as external spines again. Another hypothesis proposed that conodonts were a lineage of filter feeders. Similar to the idea that the assemblages formed a support for a lophophore, this idea maintains that the apparatuses acted both as filters and as skeletal supports for ciliary tissues. Illustrations of these reconstructed conodont apparatuses show them as long cylinders of soft tissues, with the different kinds of individual elements embedded at various locations down the length of the interior, where they could trap particles of detritus. So clearly, paleontologists were losing their minds over conodonts. For more than a century, this mystery persisted. What on earth were these creatures? Worms? Fish? Sex hooks? Some people had even suggested that they were components from crustaceans or parts of sponges. And then still others even hypothesized that conodonts weren't biological in origin at all. They thought they might just be strange inorganic minerals that formed in the oceans. But finally, in the 1980s, the holy grail of conodont research was discovered, a fossil that preserved conodont elements along with traces of soft tissues from the rest of the body. At long last, the conodont animal was revealed. In 1982, a paleontologist was looking through the collections of the Institute of Geological Sciences in Edinburgh, Scotland, when they came across an intriguing fossil that caught their eye. This fossil had been collected several decades prior, from Carboniferous-aged limestone in Scotland, dating to between about 331 and 337 million years old. However, its significance had not been realised. The specimen is preserved on two slabs of rock, as a part and counterpart, and clearly shows a long eel-like soft body with a distinct head region. Associated with the head of this creature are three separate groups of conodont elements. Clearly, these were a part of this elongate animal, and they were arranged in a way that confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that these were used for processing food. They were indeed teeth, not sex hooks. The whole body measured about 4.5 centimeters long, or about 1.8 inches, and it was mostly less than 1.8 millimeters wide, or 0.07 inches. But what was this conodont creature? The paper describing the fossil found that they couldn't confidently classify it as a member of the chordates, the group that includes all vertebrates, such as us, and their relatives. Nor could they identify it as a ketognath, predatory marine worms, commonly called arrowworms, which was another alternative suggested by some researchers. Instead, they settled on classifying conodonts as their own separate phylum. In 1986, researchers described another 3 conodont soft body fossils from the same locality in Scotland, after the rediscovery of the initial specimen prompted paleontologists to go searching for more. These additional finds were not quite as complete as the first. However, they did preserve some key features of anatomy that proved crucial in determining what kind of animals they really were. Preserved along the bodies of these animals are traces of V-shaped muscle blocks, and in the tail region there's evidence of ray-like structures that likely supported a tail fin. Additionally, it was clear that the conodont body was flattened from side to side in life, rather than these animals being flatter top to bottom. As such, the paleontologists decided that there was enough evidence to confidently associate conodonts with the chordates, rather than with any kind of worm. They were no longer considered to belong to their own phylum, and instead, it was thought that they were either close relatives to the hagfish and lampreys, or branched off from other chordates just after they did. So after all that debate, with some saying conodonts were worms, others saying they were mollusks, and some proposing they were part of the copulatory structure, it turned out that Panda had actually been fairly close to the mark back in his original description in 1856. Even more discoveries of soft-bodied conodonts continue to be made from other parts of the world, such as a conodont species called Pandarodus, named after Christian Heinrich Panda, unearthed in Wisconsin. This example, published in 1985, was older than the Scottish conodonts, coming from the Silurian period. It only preserved a faint, partial trace of the soft body from the animal, but again appeared consistent with the Scottish finds, and was associated with Pandarodus elements, which are rather elongate conical structures forming paired rows of quite formidable looking teeth. Further discoveries from Scotland continued through the late 80s and into the 1990s, uncovering even more about these creatures and suggesting that conodonts had a notochord, a stiff rod-like structure that's sort of like a precursor to a true spine. So even more evidence that conodonts are indeed chordates. Additionally, some specimens preserved large paired lobes on the head, which turned out to be the remains of the eyes, showing that these animals had proportionally very large eyes. Then, in 1995, a so-called giant conodont was discovered, again preserving soft tissues. This specimen came from South Africa and belonged to a species called Promissum pulchrum. Now, I do find it quite funny that it was hyped up as a giant conodont, considering that the thing only measures about 40 centimeters or 16 inches. But, to be fair, that is pretty large for one of these creatures. It's all about perspective after all. Hailing from the late Ordovician period, making this the oldest soft-bodied conodont found so far, the giant Promissum fossil preserves remains of the eye muscles, an associated feeding apparatus, evidence of the muscle blocks or myomeres, plus a trace of where the notochord would have been, and possible remnants of the gut. The anatomy of the V-shaped muscle blocks was found to be similar to that seen in the lancelets, tiny eel-like simple chordates that inhabit our modern oceans. As such, it was concluded that the large Promissum probably swam in a similar fashion to these living animals, being an efficient cruiser but not suited to bursts of rapid speed. Currently, the only soft-tissue conodont remains preserving the bodies that have been found are still the Scottish examples, Pandarodus and Promissum. However, there are also sites in Japan and in Canada that preserved partial conodont soft bodies, primarily bits of the head region. But it's now pretty much accepted by most researchers that the conodonts were a kind of jawless vertebrate all along, although the precise positioning of these creatures among vertebrates is still not entirely refined. It might be that they are very close relatives of the cyclostomes, the hagfish and lampreys, or they might be more derived than this lineage, branching later on. However, I must add an important side note here. In the historical classification of conodont elements, there was a traditional split of these structures into groups termed the protoconodonts, paraconodonts, and the euconodonts. It was generally thought that these groups each gave rise to the next one, forming an evolutionary series. But although the paraconodonts and the euconodonts seem to be from vertebrates, and it does seem that the paraconodonts were ancestral to the euconodonts, it turns out that the protoconodonts are in fact from relatives of Ketognath arrowworms, and have nothing to do with the true conodonts. So, in a way, the worms won after all. In recent years, now armed with an improved understanding of these creatures as jawless vertebrates, we've been able to learn a little more about the biology and lifestyles of certain true conodont species. Most notably, studies on Pandarodus have revealed that this animal was a primitive macrophagous vertebrate predator. It's not hard to imagine really. I mean, just look at the feeding elements this thing had. That is one terrifying jawless predator. By re-examining the Pandarodus soft tissue fossil from Wisconsin, researchers applied modern CT scanning techniques to reveal more about how this animal's feeding apparatus and body were laid out. They found that, unlike the Scottish conodonts and Promissum, Pandarodus actually had quite a wide body that was flattened top to bottom more than from side to side. Its tooth elements were also consistent with a predatory lifestyle, suggesting that despite its small size, it was probably a formidable hunter of little creatures that swam through the water column, capturing its prey in this basket of curved, tapering feeding elements. What a horrifying way to go. Not only that, but it seems that Pandarodus was armed with a rather ominous secret weapon as well. Looking closely at the teeth from Pandarodus specimens, you can see they have these grooves running along them. Researchers compared these grooves to the teeth and spines of many modern venomous animals, and found that the conodont grooves are remarkably similar. So not only did Pandarodus possess this terrifying tooth basket, but it's also apparently the oldest known venomous animal to have lived on the planet. Truly a formidable little predator. So that's a brief summary of the centuries-long mystery of the Conodont animal. It's truly a fantastic story of scientific progress, starting with all kinds of wild hypotheses that slowly became more and more refined over the years as more data became available. With any luck, further discoveries of conodonts with soft tissue preservation will be made, and we can learn even more about these incredible jawless vertebrates, and perhaps even develop a more certain idea of where precisely they fit in relation to lampreys and hagfish. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed learning about the conodonts, and now you know what on earth they were. Now, before we end the video, I have a very exciting announcement to make. You may remember that last year we worked with the wonderful people over at Plush Foundry to bring you an adorable Spinosaurus plushie, Swimbo. Everyone loved Swimbo so much that we've been very excited to work on another plushie, and so it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Boris the Borealopelta. Borealopelta Mark Mitchellii is the name of the stunning nodosaur specimen on display at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada, truly one of the most stunning fossils ever discovered. We thought this species would make a perfect plushie because, first of all, ankylosaurs are adorable, secondly because you guys voted for it in a poll we ran to choose our next plushie, and also because we actually have an idea of what colours Borealopelta would have been in life, thanks to the incredible preservation of this fossil. The upper surface of the dinosaur would have been a reddish-brown colour, while the underside was a paler shade. So Boris is a plushie with accurate dinosaur colours. How cool is that? Boris also features the formidable shoulder spines as you can see on the real fossil, and I have to say that he is just adorably chunky. I mean, look at that face on view. He's so round, I love him so much. This Boris is currently the only one that's been made so far, and will need your help to make Boris the Borealopelta a reality. So if you'd like to be able to purchase your own, head over to the Plush Foundry page linked below and pre-order your very own Boris. You should get them between 3 to 4 months after the campaign ends, and remember, these are limited edition plushies that won't be made again, so this is your only chance to get one. So share this around with anyone you know who might want their own accurate Borealopelta plushie. Please do like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and be sure to press that bell icon so you don't miss our next upload, and so you can learn more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all.